Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
And welcome to all board members. Welcome to our all managers. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day today to have some free education from Matt from Reserve Advisors on reserve studies. So just before we get started, a little bit about Campbell Property Management. My name is PJ Biondolillo. I'm the Director of Operations. I help a lot of our condos with a lot of the major issues that they are facing on a day-to-day basis. We've been around in business since 1953, serving areas from Miami and now all the way up to Central Florida. So we really pride ourselves on offering this free education as a resource to all board members and all property managers in the industry. You could find this event at campbellevents.org and prior events at campbellevents.org or prior webinars at campbellevents.org. So you can always find this recording on our website. So without further ado, Matt, do you have some the PowerPoint that you'd like to share?
Yes, yeah, I'll share it here just a moment. Good morning or good afternoon now, everyone, and thank you, PJ. I'm Matt Queasley with Reserve Advisors. I'm a professional engineer by trade. I've been a reserve specialist for about 25 years. Our firm has offices throughout Florida. We work with over 3,000 associations here in the state, many condo associations. We're very involved with the legislation, with the new SERS laws. So we're going to focus on that today, being that this focuses condo associations, and I'm also a condo board member. So like many of you sit in that volunteer position. In fact, we have our regular monthly meeting this evening at 6 p.m. So looking forward to giving the treasurer's report as a treasurer and updates on all things pertaining to our association. But I've been doing that for a long time as well. So look forward to the questions. I know we have the Q&A as covered, but I'll jump right in here and share the screen. The name of the course today is Safety and SERS, Reserves to the Rescue. I do apologize that we were not able to get back from the state the approval needed for the for the board member CEs. That's kind of a new program. They weren't really offering those continuing education courses last year, so it's just kind of a new approval process for us, and it's pending. Hopefully have it soon, as Ashley said, and we can teach this again for board member CE, but it is approved for 1 hour for community association managers under the insurance financial management or elective category for reserves for continuing education. There's some headshots. PJ and I, our contact information. I know this will be part of the sub or the post package as well, so I won't I'll kind of skip over that for now. We're going to talk today about the SERS chain overview. I am excited to report to that the legislative session ended on Friday, this past Friday, the 13th, without any additional significant changes for condos with regards to the SERS law. So we had 4 years of very dramatic changes, and finally going to get a year off from new laws. There could be special sessions, of course. There will be special sessions likely for the budget and other things, but don't anticipate anything dramatic changing in addition to what's already changed. So a lot of this will cover last year's changes, or the changes that went into effect July 1st. There will likely, hopefully, be some new materials. There already has been some new materials from the division on clarifying the laws and all the changes that have been made. So we'll cover some of that today as well. We're going to talk about reporting requirements and disclosures. We're going to talk about incorporating SERS into budgets. I know it's just spring, March 18th as we sit here today, but budget season always seems to come faster than you think it will. So that will be hopefully helpful information as we get into that part of the year. We're going to talk about waiving partial funding strategies and completion of the SERS, and also talk about some of the update requirements. But just to step back, again, like I said, no new laws this year, but in reaction to the tragedy in Champlain Tower South, Surfside, Florida in 2021, June 24th, where 98 people died. There was many task forces and obviously much scrutiny to what happened in that case and other community association operations. And there was three main kind of pillars that the lawmakers picked up on that they wanted to change and needed to change in reaction to that tragedy there. First was there was kind of a control, if you will, on structural components. Condos always had a requirement to fund reserves for roofs, painting, paving, and any other expense over $10,000. So that would presumably include things like concrete restoration and the waterproof membrane and the pool decks and all of those, the roofs and the electrical systems and all the things that are part of SERS now. But what happened was many boards unfortunately fell forget the word just gave me, but fell into a trap, I guess, of spending some reserve money on more readily apparent front of the house, sexier items versus the items that are back of the house, or not as readily visible, but direly important to the building. So Champlain Tower South, they knew they had some structural issues. They had water leaking through the pool deck and the garage. They had significant cracking. They had spalling, all which was visible, but not as visible as the lobby, which was gorgeous. And they spent a lot of money renovating the lobby. And the Florida House especially picked up on that and said, look, we've got to control two separate buckets of money. You can have reserves for your lobby, but we can't spend structural savings money that should be earmarked for the structural and safety of the building on aesthetic components, essentially. So they kind of, that's how we kind of came up with this bifurcated reserves. They also found that, using a quorum. So initially it was a quorum, a majority of a quorum could waive or partially fund the reserves in a condo. So a quorum might be a small percentage of the community. As long as you had a majority of those people attending in person or by proxy vote to waive, you could have a small number of people waive the reserves for the bigger group. And so we felt that was too low of a bar. So that's all been raised now to a majority of the voting interests in all types of associations are required, would be a majority of the total voting interests to waive the reserves. And then just the need for some independent inspections. And we're seeing this in states nationwide and even all over the world. This was kind of studied after this law was in place. We have a lot of inspections required when we build a building, permitting, certificate of occupancy, all of that goes through a really rigorous review process. But then the building's turned over to the owner, and unless it changes hands, single family homes change hands, they get home inspections. Commercial property changes hands, it gets a property condition report. But if a condo association overall doesn't change hands, it never gets looked at. It never gets inspected, potentially, unless the owners take that on themselves to do it. So there was no independent inspection required outside of Miami-Dade and Broward counties, and so they felt that this was be needed as our infrastructure aged, as buildings aged throughout the state. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more of this. We have seen more of this in other municipalities, other states, enacting programs of saying, hey, after some point in time, we need to re-inspect these buildings to ensure they're safe. Unfortunately, it's usually in a response to a tragedy. So California, for example, has a very stringent balcony inspection law that came from, of course, tragedies dealing with balcony inspections.
Yeah, Matt, that was great. Great summary. There has been a few questions regarding SERS and non-SERS, and I think you've hit it here, and I just wanted to clarify for those who submitted questions earlier. One question I saw was, it is unclear if only SERS are mandatory. So both, funding of SERS and non-SERS is mandatory. However, you have the ability with a majority vote of the unit owners to waive or partially fund only the non-SERS piece. So that SERS piece you have to fully fund, and the non-SERS piece is a majority vote, as Matt just said, if you're going to partially fund.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and the board really has the obligation to show the fully funded amount on both. And that's kind of where the board's obligation stops. So some boards feel they have to because they've always done it, previous board always gave the membership that option to waive or partially fund, the reserves, whether it's, in a two-story building, it could be all the reserves. In a SERS building, it could be the non-structural, but the board does not have to give the members that option to waive the reserves. Just want to
That
point
is
that out.
correct.
They can give it to them, but they don't have to. And privy
Right.
boards are going to say, look, all we're doing by waiving those reserves is setting our next board up, or a future board up, for a difficult situation where there's a project needed. It's inevitably going to cost money. Where's that money going to come from? It's going to have to come from either a special assessment or a loan, or unfortunately that project's going to get deferred. And that's what we're up against as condo board members. As I put my board hat on and I remind folks in my community, whether we budget appropriately or not, the projects are going to cost what the projects are going to cost. Our planning for them really doesn't impact how much those projects are going to cost or when they're needed. So it's kind of like, you have to take that responsibility and say, look, it's better to pay a little bit as we go instead of special assessing down the line. But don't want to get too far off track there. But thanks for bringing that up, PJ, and clarifying that.
Yep.
I did see some questions on there. So what is structural? So the lawmakers really keyed in on, look, we need a list. We need a component list of what's included in these structural items. And so here's the list in front of you. I would argue some of these items are not structural, but nonetheless, here's what it is. So the roof's the structure, including load-bearing walls and primary structural systems, as those terms are defined. They're essentially just defined as items that support loads in the building. So that's, as you would expect, most of the components of the framing of the building, structural. Fireproofing, fire protection, plumbing, electrical systems, those are ones I don't think are structural, but nonetheless, they're part of the SERS, and they have to be, they're treated the same as the structure of the building. Waterproofing, exterior painting, windows and exterior doors. Specifically, though, they clarified after the initial law came out, they clarified this list and said, these are only for association responsible items. So windows and doors that are the owner's responsibility do not have to be part of the SERS or the association's funding. Those can be funded as individual owners. Now, there may be benefit to the association. I don't know, PJ, do you see that sometimes where the building will get together and say, hey, even though these are owner responsibility, we're going to get bulk pricing and replace all the windows as a group?
Yeah, we do see, obviously it's always challenging when, getting more, homeowners involved and the membership involved and getting a unit owner vote for, taking on those items. But we have seen that strategy, and especially in the condos where they're smaller, that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah. But for the purposes of the law, again, you're only looking at common area windows and doors as mandatory SERS items. And then there's a catch-all in the statute that says any other item that has a deferred maintenance expense or replacement cost that exceeds $25,000. And that used to be 10,000. Now it's 25,000 as of last July. And in fact, in February, they upped it to $25,675. So they're going to be continually adjusting that amount with inflation. They felt, the $10,000 was appropriate when it was put in 1984. But that, equivalent today's dollars is more like 25,000. And so they're going to say, we're just going to keep that as a bit of a adjustable target based on inflation. I'm having a lot of associations say, well, a $15,000 project is going to blow our whole operating budget away. So I'll put, we can have a lower threshold. It's just that the threshold can't be any higher than 25,675 this year. And then the important part here is that if it's an item that would negatively affect the items listed on the prior slide, then it should be included. So I put things like seawalls. If they're close to the structure, we might put the seawalls in there, retaining walls, swimming pools. If it's on the other side of the parking lot, it's probably not going to be structural, but if it's above the garage or on the ceiling of the roof of the building, it's likely going to be incorporated as a part of the structural components. I'm often putting stairs and railings in there, again, kind of falling under this category. If we don't repair the stairs or railings, even though they may not be structural load-bearing parts of the building, the post pockets that the railings sit in, or the rust that is accumulating on the railings, is going to negatively affect the structure. So I think it's important to kind of expand it to some of those components, facade components and screens. But there are many,
Yeah,
many,
Matt,
many
we
other
just had a
components.
question on that in the chat about just balcony railings. So, can you explain that, just because it's, the way it's, sitting on the structure and whatnot, and, that it could definitely be SERS, and just work with your professional, when they're giving guidance on this, because every single building is a little bit differently.
Correct. Yeah, I've seen some engineers that say no, they're not structural, and I kind of agree. The railings themselves are not structural, but I think they fall into that last category where if you don't maintain the railings, which are connected directly to the structure, that it could impact the slab of the balcony, and that's where my concern comes in, and why we typically include the railings on there. But you're right; each engineer that you're working with is going to kind of get to use their discretion, even on this list. So my interpretation of the list says, all of these items here are not included in the structural integrity reserve study, and a lot of my colleagues in this industry, would agree with this list. But I'm sure there's some on here that some would say, well, if we don't have HVAC, then that could negatively impact the structure over many years because it's going to increase the moisture content in the ambient air. There's arguments to be made. So really going to kind of maybe look at your property and see what's included in there. We did see, a whole bunch of new reserve study providers come into the market and look at and do structural integrity reserve studies, and some were very aggressive, including things like elevators, because they do have electrical components as SIRS items. We tend to think that they're not part of the SIRS, and most are saying, the elevators are not part of the SIRS, but still extremely important. So back to that original idea of, we have to have not only reserves for our structural components, but non-structural too, right, PJ?
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of dovetails into one of the questions that was submitted, and I thought it was a really interesting question, where it was, what are the three biggest mistakes you see boards making when it comes to reserve studies? And honestly, one of the biggest ones that I saw was just not taking advantage of using the professionals and just getting a SIRS because it was required, and not doing the non-structural, because there is so much that you have to consider when funding appropriately for a building and keeping the values up and keeping the building maintained. I mean, the elevators, the HVAC, all this stuff, costs a lot of money. So getting, the professional to assess the building and build that funding plan is only going to be extremely valuable to the association.
Percent, yeah, and I would echo that. Yeah, that's where a lot of, frankly, our reserve providers can fall short in that area, and helping boards understand and explain it. But then boards, need to press on their providers to understand that stuff too. One thing we get, and I feel this too as board members. I'll just add to that question. One of the other big mistakes I feel is that the board gets the study and gets a little bit of sticker shock or heartburn over the costs that are included, and they'll say things like, "Well, it can't possibly cost that long. We will never do that. Reserve study provider can't be right." And then they kind of stop there and don't challenge the reserve provider. They just say that the study's wrong, and then they don't communicate to the membership, and they take it personally that the numbers maybe aren't what they were expecting to be, or aren't consistent with what they've been told or what they've told their community in the past. And I think that's one of the kind of the big mistakes, is like trying to take that on yourself as a board member, instead of saying, you know what, this is information. There may be a reasoning behind it. There may be something that we're not considering. Get that out to the member. It's not your job to keep that from the membership. It's just really important to share that with the membership, that we've gotten this information. And absolutely, if you get a different opinion, or if you have a different opinion, voice that, right?
Yeah, 100%. Another common mistake I see is not giving the reserve study professional, the information that you have, whether it's, quotes, things that happened in the past, getting the experts involved who know your community the best, and involving them in the production and the review of the reserve study.
It's hard to do because as boards change over, some of that stuff is just not known. And oftentimes we get into a project and we find out something, oh, by the way, we didn't know this at the time that we held our kickoff meeting, but we did find out from someone that had been here a long time ago that was actually replaced, or that we've had some repairs on that in the past, or that was not put in at the original construction or something. So just that history, that's a good point, PJ. And it's always something we're trying to refine, and it's never, I don't think we ever get it perfect, because that's who we are as humans, and as estimators. There's always going to be some assumptions that we have to make that may not be 100% accurate. So something to keep in mind. Jumping to who needs the SIRS. So they changed this in 25 last year to make it only responsible for 3 habitable stories or higher. So condo buildings with 3 habitable stories or higher. They also added that 4-family dwellings with 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground could be excluded. So smaller buildings, single family, 2-family, 3-family, or 4-family dwellings with three or fewer habitable stories above ground, or other buildings with fewer than 3 habitable stories above ground can be excluded. The habitable is defined as containing spaces for eating, sleeping, cooking, or living. So if you just got storage or bathrooms, hallways on the first floor, garage spaces on the first floor, and 2 residential floors above with habitable spaces, that building would be considered to have only 2 habitable stories and may no longer be required to have a SERS, even though it was required in the initial iterations of this law. And then, yeah, any portion of the building that is not maintained by the association. So like we talked about, if it's the windows and doors, or if it's not submitted to the condominium form of ownership. Other note here is it's just for residential condominiums, not necessarily commercial condominiums. What's included, we have to include those items, of course, but we need to state the useful life, remaining useful life, replacement cost, and expense of the item. We may exclude items with an indeterminate life or a life of greater than 25 years. So the initial iteration of the law, some of you might remember, said foundation and floors. Well, if the foundation of the building is going to exceed 25 years of remaining useful life, it can be excluded. But the reserve provider may say, look, the structure is going to outlast the 25 years, but concrete restoration or waterproofing or repairs may be needed. And so we include that instead. Who conducts the SERS? Licensed engineers, licensed architects, reserve specialists, or professional reserve analysts. Just in last year, they added a note that said if one of these folks is qualified to do the study, but also intends to bid on related services. So they tend to manage the concrete project that you're going to inevitably be taking on, that must be disclosed upfront when you get the proposal for the reserve study. And there's just unfortunately some bad actors, I think, that initially came out and were a little bit manipulative or hiding conflicts of interest to their potential customers, and the lawmakers said, look, we got to make sure that that's all disclosed up front. If the engineer wants to do the project work after they do the reserve study, that's totally fine. Just has to be disclosed up front so everyone knows kind of that there is that relationship there.
Matt, we did have a question about can an association board or management company do your SERS and non-SERS reserve studies?
No, I mean, it has to be an independent person. It has to have one of these designations. So I don't think boards or that could do. Now, this is for a structural integrity reserve study. Sorry, PJ, I don't know if the question was about other reserve studies, because there isn't. If you don't have the 3 habitable stories, you don't need the structural integrity reserve study. There isn't really, the law is silent on who can do the study. Best practice, of course, would be to still hire independent professionals on that. But if you don't have, just want to be clear, if you don't have to have a SERS, you don't have to hire a professional to do a structural integrity. You don't have to hire a professional to do a reserve study, period. That's practice, but yeah, and of course, full disclosure, I'm biased by my role, but it's challenging. I think, just to take that a little bit further, board members often will do them, and you might get an engineer that's really, has a lot of time on their hands and a lot of dedication towards doing their own reserve study and does a great job. But keep in mind that board member probably won't be there forever, and so as they turn over, who's going to take that on? And that we often get called in situations like that where there's been, a very active board or someone that's kept up a reserve schedule pretty well, honestly, for many years. But then as they're transitioning out of the board, they move out of the community, whenever they're retiring from their community service of being on the board, they want to have to turn it over to a professional to take all that time and effort and liability away. And most management companies that I talk to don't want that liability either, and don't recognize like this is where you hire a professional instead of trying to DIY.
Right, but for SERS, 100%, you need the license and you need to hire an independent professional.
Thank you. Yes. And then when they did extend the deadline for buildings existing on or before July 1st, the deadline was now December 31st, 2025. So they extended it last year, but it's already passed again. So if you haven't done it, you're past due, unless the association turned over after July, the association existed after July 1st. Or if the milestone inspection was due by the end of this year, then they can coordinate the SIRS with the milestone inspection. So there's a few buildings that kind of had that birthday of 30 years and the milestone inspections required this year. They could do the SIRS this year with the milestone inspection. In last year, though, they did say that you can delay the SIRS, and this is something they probably, if they would have thought of it, would have put in earlier on. But if they conduct a milestone inspection, that gives for 2 years, it gives a bit of a reprieve. So the association doesn't have to do their SIRS for up to 2 budget years following the milestone inspection. And this was kind of a trend of what the feedback was from a lot of buildings. Well, first of all, there's a lot of pushback from older buildings and buildings that have been around for a long time and not repaired. They thought this was unfair that the legislature was making them do these SIRS at the same time that they did the milestone inspection. So imagine a building that is 40 years or 50 years old and hadn't saved anything, and now they got a milestone inspection, so they've got a lot of repairs because they were in disrepair. So they had to spend maybe millions of dollars doing those repairs, and on top of that, reserving for maybe the roof that they just replaced. So it was a bit of a double hit that they were never reserving, and they had these repairs done. So they kind of said, well, let's prioritize the milestone inspection and give people 2 years to conduct their SIRS after the milestone inspection. Distribution is very important. This has been something they want to make sure. Again, transparency is of the utmost importance. One of the bigger complaints that the division gets is that associations are not being transparent with their documents and the workings that the board is doing. So within 45 days of completion of the SIRS, they must distribute it for each owner, or at least make it available electronically is fine. And they must also provide a statement to the division that it was completed. Last year, they added that an officer or director must also sign an affidavit acknowledging the receipt of the completed SIRS. So they're trying to avoid those buildings and address those buildings that said, well, we got the SIRS done, but we don't agree with it, so we're going to hide it from everyone. They're trying to make sure that doesn't happen. And if you don't agree with it, or if you feel there are issues with it, take that right back to the reserve provider and have them make the changes. And again, you can get a second opinion if you want, but I'd always recommend starting with the firm that you've already engaged to do the SIRS. And if there's a reason, understand their reasoning for the recommendations instead of just saying we don't agree with it. But covered that already, kind of. And then the division must have a database and keep a list of all the communities that have completed SIRS, and it's an official record. So now we're seeing. I want to point out this new reserve. New license. MyFloridaLicense.com is the DBPR's website. They added a new site called condos.myfloridalicense.com. And this has a lot of information on it about, how to report that SIRS to the division, how to file a complaint with the division, and a lot of the FAQs around all these new requirements. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at this, bookmark this. It's just a ton of information, and it's updated as new information comes available. So if the law does change or the division releases a new update or more information, they put that on this site, and it's been a good resource for communities there. Much more user friendly, I think, than the traditional myfloridalicense.com website.
Yeah, it is. And just as a side note, the online account that condo boards need to create as a result of HB 913, there's a section for SIRS and reporting that you'll also need to. Oh, here it is. I'm get ahead of the schedule here.
Yep. No, exactly. And there's instructions on how to do it. That account. It's kind of a lengthy step. I think I counted all the SIRS, just to insert the SIRS is like 16 different steps that you have to follow to do that. So it is a bit of work, but it allows them they're trying to get a handle on the communities that they are responsible for overseeing as that government agency. So I'm assuming PJ Campbell kind of went and created these accounts on behalf of their associations, and then the management company handles the submission of this.
Yes, absolutely. So if you have any questions about that, you can reach out to us or contact your attorney. But yes, each condo should have an account that has been created with the information that's submitted to the DBPR. And there's other information too, like board member information, general assessment information. There's, I think, 3 or 4 different sections. This is just one of the sections.
Right. Yep. You got to link the managing entity, and it's quite an extensive
It's
process.
confusing,
So
but
yes,
yes.
it is. It is,
Yeah.
it is, but that, yeah, and that's, just another reason as a volunteer board member, people, I'm in a small community. They say, why do we need the manager? It's like for stuff like this. I do not have the desire, the know-how to do this type of administrative stuff. So I
To
appreciate,
link the project number with
yeah,
the
thank you.
managing entity
Yeah,
and all of,
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Thank you to our managers out there and managing companies that are putting the time and effort and getting this all up to date, because then it becomes visible. All of this now is visible to anyone. So it is important. They need to see it, and they need to be able to make sure that you're on there, because what'll happen, and this is just a screenshot of the database that they're compiling. This is just a few buildings in Naples that are on there. You can go and search your buildings on there and see that it was done. And I guess the bigger question is, well, what happens if you don't do this? If you don't have a manager that took care of that for you, or you're not on the list? Well, I think it's going to become harder to sell units in buildings that don't do this. So there are some very specific disclosures on the new sales requirement, on the new sales documents. So the condominium rider on a resale or a lease of a condo requires that the SERS be furnished to this prospective buyer or leasee, or conspicuous type that it hasn't been done, and then specific disclosures that if are not put on the contract, then the sale or lease is voidable, really right up to the closing. So it's going to be harder. So what this has turned into, I think, is that the management companies, and I'm sorry, the mortgage companies and the insurance agents that are trying to insure the unit, and make sure that the mortgage wants to make sure that the unit has insurance on it, are looking to say, hey, is this community in compliance? Do we want to get into business in this association by lending or writing a mortgage in this area? And unfortunately, many associations have found themselves on a blacklist from Fannie Mae, that is, of course, the federal backer of a lot of these mortgages. And if you're not eligible for transfer within Fannie Mae, then a lot of the banks are not going to lend in the community. So like I said, it's going to probably get harder to sell a building, or sell units in buildings that don't have this, or don't have kind of all these boxes checked with respect to the SERS. I think that was one of the questions we got early on. What happens if we don't do this? Like, how are we going to know? Well, the division is trying to get a handle on it, but I think before the division would know about it, if no one files a complaint on bring that association to their attention, it's probably going to be more the industry, being the mortgage companies and insurance, that's going to first bring this to the board's attention, that there's an issue with the compliance when it comes to these new requirements. So that's just another reason to take care of this and to do it. Have you seen that, PJ, where mortgage companies are asking, and potential buyers really are asking that?
Oh
That get
yeah,
involved in.
absolutely. Reserves and this is, becoming just a much bigger part of the sale process, 100%.
Yeah, and it makes sense, because again, it's the biggest investment that most people make is their homes, and they want to make sure that they're getting involved with an association that's being prudent and planning ahead for them, and it will impact the sale value. And that's when we get, as a board member, when I get pushback from owners, that say, well, we don't want the fees so high, or we wish we didn't have to do this. Really all this is the board doing their fiduciary duty of maintaining the community in good standing, so that they're protecting the investment that everybody has in there. It's protection of all of the owners. They're not, it's not just to make fees higher for the sake of making fees higher. Or assessments higher. It's to protect that investment and make sure that the value of the unit stays where it should. So budget season we're going to talk a little bit about incorporating into the budget. So the budget now, and I think there's still a little bit of disconnect, and we're hopeful there's a new budgets and training manual, which I might try to put into the chat if do I have access to the chat? Yeah. Just to the hosting panel. So, oh no, I can put it for everyone. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the new budgets and reserves training manual. It's a pretty detailed schedule. It's been around for a while, but it was just updated last month and released by the division. And it's kind of got examples and input and step by step of how to really incorporate the reserve budgets, or how to incorporate the reserve studies into the budget, and what required disclosures are and all of that stuff. Again, your manager is going to take care of most of this for you, but if you have interested board members, this is a helpful resource. And I think one of the things I want to point out here is that there is probably still some disconnect in, should we create an updated schedule, or should we just use what the SIRS has, especially if my SIRS now is 3-4 years old? Should I still be using those numbers, or should I be updating the schedule? We don't quite have clarity on that yet. And so but they're open to feedback on it. And I would love for everyone to reach out to the division and say, hey, look, we got to answer this question so we know what to do one way or the other.
Matt, that's been probably the most common question. It's been here in the chat a few times, and it was also submitted, all right, we got our SIRS and non-SIRS. Now we're in year 2, and things have happened, because ultimately the SIRS, your reserve study is just a guide. It's an estimate, right? So, after the first year, what happens? And so there is a disconnect, I think, between the lawmakers, the division, and what's actually happening. Because in HB 913, there's a section in there, and definitely double check with your attorney. But there's a section in there that says that, you in order to adjust the funding plan, it needs to be done by a professional company. So, really, if there's something, where you spent more money on concrete restoration than you anticipated in year 2, and you need to adjust the funding plan because that you spent more and you're probably underfunded, you really need to go to your reserve study professional to get an updated SIRS. Now, from a non-SIRS standpoint, where there isn't this law that is governing the non-SIRS and the update, you could probably, get away with updating the schedule and the reserve study analysis. It's still best practice to go to the reserve study company to get the full desktop update. But what we're seeing is if you're going to adjust the plan, especially for SIRS, you should be going to your reserve study professional to do those updates. Now, the law is also a bit unclear because, and again, we're not lawyers, so double check with your attorneys. But from my understanding, this has been a common question. What is the required amount to get an update? How many years? And I believe it's 10 years, which kind of contradicts what they say about, having a professional update the study. So you really should be doing this, nearly every year, or at least when you have something big or there's a drastic change in the funding plan of what's occurred. So we really encourage you to reach out to your professionals, reach out to your attorney if you need some clarification. But this has been, I'm sorry not to give a direct answer, but the law really isn't clear, and the division really hasn't been clear either on how this stuff applies in year 2, 3, 4, 5 down the line.
Exactly. Major issue. In fact, that training manual that I just shared in the chat, that kind of says you got to update the schedule each year. Well, the statute says something different. It says you have to follow the most recent structural integrity reserve study. So there is a disconnect there, and there will be. I'm told the division will be releasing an updated administrative code. So the administrative code is kind of what that manual is based on. Well, the administrative code hasn't been updated since 2002.
Right. That's the craziest thing. It's like they made all these updates to the law, but they didn't update the administrative code, which outlines a lot of the procedures for creating reserve schedules. But
Correct.
It's saying you need to have a professional to get these studies done, or the SIRS part done. And if you want to make an update to the funding plan, you got to get it done by a reserve professional. So again, if you're going to do something, make sure you get your attorney involved. The safest bet and the best bet is to go to the professional and get it updated directly from them. And that way you're covering all of your bases in that situation.
And we have all of us have a level 3 update. We call it. It's an update without a site visit. So it's not like we're starting over. We're just updating numbers that have changed and costs that have changed. cost of inflation that's occurred since the last study, so that you've got an updated schedule for your membership. So that's, I agree, best practice, and we'll hopefully get some more clarity from them coming up. I think that they were kind of nervous that there has been changes very frequently, and so they were hesitant to put something out and then have the law change the next year and have to put something out. But I'm thinking now that we finally have a year off of law changes, that we can get the agency to get the updated schedules out. And they've told me is that encouragingly that they are working on that and should have that out here soon. And in fact, they had a lot of it ready to go. We're just kind of waiting to see what happened this session. So back to as it currently is written, pausing. This was introduced in last year in 913 as well. Now budgets adopted before December 23rd, December 31st of 2028 can be paused or reduced for the purposes of funding repairs recommended by the milestone inspection. So I think there's some judgment that goes in here, but again, like we said before, if you have priority projects that have come up because of the milestone inspection, the funding can be paused. It does require a vote of the owners, and I don't think you should pause more funding than you're spending on the milestone inspection repairs. So that's my own opinion on that. But if the milestone says you got a $10,000 repair, but the SIR said you got to fund $100,000 a year, I don't think I'd pause all $100,000 just because you had that small repair that was taken care of by the milestone. But people will get creative, and I think good advice from PJ there to consult your attorney if you're considering varying from the plan, either putting one of these fundings pauses in here. They added the ability to use special assessments, loans, or line of credit to the funding plans, so we can incorporate those now. But again, that has to be approved by the unit owners to do that, and the loan or line of credit must be immediately available for use by the board. The issue with loans and line of credit is just kind of pushing that expense out to a future board. Again, it makes sense if there's a near-term project that you need to spend the money on right away, but if you're not spending that money, if you're not drawing on the line of credit, for example, you're just creating a bigger liability for a future board. So most are not going that route because they realize it's kind of just creating a bigger problem later down the road. But it is an option, and that is one of the things that triggers the need for an actual professional to do an update if you pause or vary from the plan. I think we covered most of this. And this, I want to keep moving here. Pooled reserves are allowed. They've kind of always been allowed, but now it says the board can decide the accounting method without a vote of the members, whether they want to switch between accounting methods. We've heard different legal opinions here, and PJ, yeah, we didn't maybe give a full disclosure here, but neither of us are attorneys. None of this is legal advice. It's just information that we've interpreted or heard from others. We're not trying to say this is any kind of legal interpretation here, but here's what the statute says. And what we do know, that pooled reserve, most associations are switching to pooled reserves because of the flexibility and the lower funding requirements. But moving money that's already existing in a straight line, most attorneys are saying that would still require a vote of the owners because of that, I guess, because of this previous slide that I had up here that says the reserve funds and any interest accruing thereon shall only be used for another purpose if approved in advance by the total voting interest of the association. So that is still in place. And of course, that doesn't apply to SIRS. You can't use SIRS for anything else, but you can use the general reserves or the non-structural reserves for other items with the vote of the owners to approve.
Yeah, and again, check with your attorney, because I've heard, I've heard attorneys say that, the law clarified this and therefore, it's a homeowner vote is allowed, or, again, it's another gray area. So just double check with your attorney if you're going to be, doing this, and that's the best piece of advice we can give you.
Yeah, good point. I want to touch quickly on three funding strategies. I know we're getting short on time, and we want to save some time at the end for questions, but fully funded, the term fully funded is probably one of the most confusing terms out there, I think, for boards. I know we had some questions about that. And so we're working, I'm been promoting these definitions. These definitions are straight from the International Reserve Study standards. One of the terms baseline funding showed up in our 913 and is now kind of part of the lingo the language here in Florida, and really says that the reserves are simply above zero. That we look at a cash flow of reserves, we say we just need enough inflows to ensure that the outflows do not go below zero. And that's baseline funding. In fact, baseline funding is by design goes to zero at some point over the life of the cash flow analysis. Threshold funding we'll come back to. Full funding, on the other hand, means we've got 100% of the fully funded balance on hand in the bank. So we've got all the money accumulated based on the proportionate cost of useful life of life that's expired. So it essentially asks the question, if we started reserving component by component on the day each item was placed in service, how much would we have in the bank for each component right now? So it's a higher, usually a much higher number, a much more conservative target of reserves, and it's not actually the requirement in the state. The state says we have to. The administrative code has always said, it has to just ensure the cash inflows keep the balance positive. The 913 now adds that the SERS have to include a baseline funding plan, and it's kind of the minimum. We'd call that the minimum reserve amount that would be needed, and the full funding is again a much higher number. And most associations don't ever need to be 100% funded or have 100% of the fully funded balance on hand at any one point, because they're not replacing all the items at any one point in time. So it's a more conservative approach. Most of our associations look at the threshold, which says, instead of targeting zero, let's target some amount above zero, so that we've got a little bit of a cushion there. And I'll show you some example here. Again, cost to fund is much higher with full funding, but of course the risk level is a little bit higher with baseline funding, or a lot higher with baseline funding. So most kind of like to find this middle ground of what works best for them. Quick case study. This is just a real simple example of the different strategies. So this is an association that has, these expenditures. The blue kind of bars going down below zero are the expenses each year. So some years you can see they have big expenses. Some years they don't have anything happening. But we've got a stable set of green bars in this bar graph, and these are the inflows each year, how much is going in to keep that balance, which is the purple line. Above zero, it goes all the way up over to 300,000 and kind of hovers back and forth and then drops to zero after this big project in the 2049, 2050 area. So it goes down to zero. And in this case, that scenario resulted in annual funding of $132 per owner. Same exact expense schedule, same association, targeting a threshold where you see the reserve balance, instead of going to zero, stays about a little over 100,000. That it's a prudent decision for a board to say, look, we want to make sure we've got some uninsured things, we've got some unanticipated expenses perhaps, so let's leave 100,000 in there. And the difference in this case was like $9 per owner per year to fund it, a small association. Full funding, on the other hand, plans typically look like this, where the balance goes up to a very high number and kind of never comes back down, just stays up at a really high amount. And you can see the impact here again. It takes a while to get to 100% funded. This orange line is percent funded, which you didn't see on the other ones. But it does go up to gets to 100% funded after about 25 years and hovers at that point, but it's a much higher contribution to keep all of that money on the bank. And the question I asked this association is, do you need to have $1 million in the bank? You're never spending more than $500,000 in any, I'm sorry, never more than $250,000 in any one year. Why would you need to have $1 million on hand at any one time? And most would say that would agree with that. Targeting 100% funded seems a little bit aggressive. Now, some will say, okay, well, then let's target 70% funded and stay at this level. I still think it's somewhat arbitrary to say that, but it's really up to each board what they want to target. But that minimum level is allowable, and I think that's what a lot of associations are looking for, especially ones that have been underfunded in the past. We covered anything else on fully funded there, PJ? Anything else you want me to add? I know that was
no. I think you covered it. It's often confusing, for boards, for managers, for everyone. These terms that get thrown around. But essentially, what's required by law, if you're doing a pooled reserve schedule, is that you put together the funding plan so it never goes below zero, or whatever your reserve study professional recommends and puts in the study. So please, if you have, questions, follow your professionals, talk to your attorney. But the terminology, between baseline funding and, the full technical full funding can get confusing. But what's required by law is different. So.
Yep, absolutely. And we kind of covered this a little bit, I think already today. Just again, a reminder, you can get a second opinion. Um, when we do, in most of our industry, when we do a report, it's considered complete. We give you the report. We're not asking for the board to sign off on it or agree to it. That's how most engineers operate. You just like that's the information. So just because the board you may not agree, I think you still have a complete SIRS on your hand. Now, again, my first recommendation, if you don't agree with it, or if you feel that there's information missing or incorrect, go back to that provider and ask for an update or ask for a change to that initial report. And shouldn't be any issue with getting that if it's a reasonable request. And then just to recap, there's three kind of items that would require now mandate a SIRS update. It's 10 years is the required frequency unless you've paused the reserve contributions for the purpose of funding repairs in the milestone inspection. If it was performed before an approved special assessment loan or line of credit, or if the budget does not align with the most recent service. So all three of those cases were put into the law and says, that would trigger the need for those updates. Like we talked about, it could be a level 3 update, desk update, or a level 2 update, which would be another inspection of the property. But either way, the good news is you don't have to start from scratch to do those updates. But updates are important, and they really result in a solid framework, allow, and again, at the end of the day, minimize the cost of ownership, because associations don't have other options. The worst option is to not do a project in a timely manner. And unfortunately, that's what many boards are faced doing when the reserves are not adequate for the projects at hand. So got through the slides. I'm sure we got a ton more questions. We can do some rapid fire.
I've been trying my best to be typing, listening, and going through. But
Okay,
I'd say
cool.
one that came up once before was please define what can be charged to reserves and what is repairs and maintenance.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the statute says, whatever the reserves are, what their intended purpose for is, can be charged for reserves. So you can put a line item in your reserve schedule that says we're going to do maintenance to our cooling tower every 10 years. We're going to tear down and clean it out, and we're going to make that a reserve item. So if it's listed in your reserve schedule, you can use the reserve funds for it. If it's not listed on the reserve schedule, you can't. And where the real gray area comes in is like roofs. So we'll have roofs listed in the reserve schedule. We'll say, okay, 20 years, replace the roof. Well, can we use money to do a leak? We have a leak. Can we use the reserve money to do that repair? Personally, I put that as a no, because I think that the intent of those reserves was for roof replacement. That's how we've defined that. But there's nothing preventing you from putting a line item in your reserves that says roof repair, and then spending roof money on that section.
But it's really got to be in the study. If it's not in the study, and typically if it's not extending the useful life, like a major enhancement, and that keep me in between the navigational beacons here. If it's not extending, the useful life above what is like a normal repair, it really should be repair and maintenance. It all falls into, capital improvements versus, normal maintaining versus replacements.
Right,
So,
right. And the administrative code does define reserve expenses as capital expenditures and deferred maintenance. Both would be capital expenditures, simply a replacement of an asset that has a useful life of more than 1 year, and deferred maintenance would be a repair to an asset that happens less frequently than annually. So it shouldn't be something that happens every year.
right.
It's kind of how the statutes define it. But again, they go further than that and say, the item has to be listed in the reserve in order to spend money on it.
Right, right. There's been, a few other questions. We have over 1,600 trees in the community. And we'll need to obviously, replace them at some point, or maintain them or trim them. Is this a reserve item?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to put them in as a reserve item. Would it be mandated? Probably not. It's not listed as a SIRS item, and it's, it's one of the items. So in that training manual and in the administrative code, it says if you can replace an individual item for less than $25,000, it doesn't have to be in there. So one tree itself could be replaced for less than 25,000, hopefully. So that tree, individually is not mandated to be as a reserve item. But when you have hundreds of trees, I think it's very prudent to put that in the reserve. So I'd say it's more of a, discretionary reserve item, if you will, but it certainly would be something. And once you start reserving for it, I think it makes sense to keep it in there and to have those funds set aside because they won't last forever. The useful life is a little bit difficult to predict on a tree, of course, but I think it's prudent to have reserves for that for sure.
Yeah, this came up twice, and I'm just going to probably say check with your attorney. If you have a structural engineering study performed and SIRS, but you're a two-story condo, does that still qualify for all the reporting requirements? I check with your attorney. You didn't technically need to get it done, but a lot of the engineering inspections that that you might qualify are really governed by the county or municipality. So a lot of that you might have need to, just talk to your attorney about the reporting requirements. That's a little bit of a nuance.
Yeah.
Last year we were told we had option to not fully fund our non-SIRS account. Does that continue to be the rule? So again, what's mandatory is to fully fund both SIRS and non-SIRS. Non-SIRS can be partially funded with a majority unit owner vote. So, they're both required to be funded, just the SIRS portion cannot be waived whatsoever or partially funded. The non-SIRS can be with a majority vote of the unit owners. But the board does have the requirement to present a fully funded option under both. Um, a couple other questions that came up is, do we need to have SIRS and non-SIRS into separate bank accounts? So 100% needs to be accounted for separately. Talk to your attorney. Again, if it needs to be in separate, physical bank accounts. We've heard varying opinions on both, but it definitely, you can't use SIRS funds for non-SIRS ever. You could potentially use SIRS, non-SIRS for SIRS with a majority unit owner vote. But, again, if you're going to be doing any of the, this stuff, and talk to your attorneys because there's so much nuance within the law. There's so much gray area within the law. Talk to your professional, but that's, the general, feel of it from, what we're seeing in the industry.
Yeah, most of the CPAs I talk to say it's best practice to put two different bank accounts because remember you have the interest, and the interest has to stay with the where
That
it
is
was
correct.
where it was earned. And so if you have it all in one bank account, which I think is allowed, but not a best practice, then you have to come up with some formula to ration out that interest earnings into the two.
Theoretically, it would
liabilities.
be the
Proportionate.
amount of,
Yeah.
how much SIRS or non-SIRS are in your liability. And, that's how you would prorate it. But, again, yeah, I agree with you, Matt. All right. That was a question. Can you move funds from regular pool reserves account to SIRS so talk to your attorney, but our understanding, or at least my understanding, Matt, correct me if you have a different understanding, is if you're going from non-SIRS to SIRS, it would require a majority unit owner vote. If you're going to move, the funding for your, the lobby renovation or whatnot into concrete restoration, that would require a majority unit owner vote. But again, check with your attorney. Uh, So, sorry, there's lots of questions. If reserves are pooled, don't the reserve line items need to be accounted for separately? If not, how can one account for differences in remaining the design life? So really, the pooled schedule is a cash flow analysis of every single one of your components. So it does list out every single one of your components on that cash flow schedule. So that's something that Reserve Advisors does in their studies. And and maps it out so that you are in accordance with the funding baseline, threshold and fully funding. And so that's where all of your components are listed out, but you could use the funds for items in that schedule when they become due. And that's the benefit of the flexibility. So yes, they do need to be listed out in that schedule, but from an accounting standpoint, it is all falls into one bucket. But, again, if there's something that comes up, earlier than expected, or it's more than it was expected, definitely, talk to your professional about getting an updated study because it's really, really important to stay on track with your reserves, especially as we get into years 2, 3, 4, 5 after this, new requirement. So best practice is to get an update from your professional.
Yeah, just to clarify too, there's a couple questions on the two-story that I'm seeing here. Yeah, if it's two-story, I don't think you need a SERS, and I don't like. I think you still have structural components of your building, of course. Each building has structural components, but it's looked at differently in the eyes of the DBPR. So that's to answer Miriam's question there.
Great. All right. Well, I know we're approaching 1 p.m. here. Matt, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your expertise. You've really gone above and beyond with this presentation, so we certainly appreciate it.
Thanks for having it. Yep, and please, reach out. I know there's a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to, but please, I know Ashley will send you our contact information and things, so don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to be a resource and hopefully help all communities get this right.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.